As always, the opinions expressed in this program do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of DKI APCSS, the U.S. Department of Defense, or the U.S. government.
Insofar as we live in a highly integrated global economy, economic warfare is the essential first phase of preparing for conventional war. So what happens in the economic warfare space will determine, I think, whether deterrence is restored to where we need it to be, or alternatively, if we're on a very bad path to conventional conflict.
Aloha, and welcome to Dialogue, where conversation shapes security. I'm your host, James Minnich, Colonel United States Army retired and professor here at the Daniel K. Inouye Asia Pacific Center for Security Studies in Honolulu, Hawaii. It's a pleasure to have you join us for episode 38, Frontlines of Economic Warfare. Economic warfare is reshaping global power. We often think of warfare in terms of military might, troops, ships, and missiles. But today, the most potent weapons are often economic, finance, technology, and industrial capacity. Nations are wielding these tools to coerce, weaken, and gain control, sometimes without firing a single shot. This isn't just about trade disputes or healthy competition. It's about weaponizing money, markets, and supply chains to gain strategic dominance. Economic warfare plays out through sanctions, resource control, financial manipulation, and cyber attacks, targeting critical infrastructure. It involves monopolizing key industries and using strategic investments for influence rather than profit. The battlefield is everywhere. Technology, supply chains, industrial bases, natural resources, and global markets. The stakes are high, shaping national security, alliances, and the balance of power worldwide. Canada is at the front lines of this conflict. It holds highly sought-after resources, critical minerals, energy, advanced technology, and is deeply integrated into the U.S. economy and defense industrial base. This makes Canada a key player in a growing strategic struggle. China, Russia, and other authoritarian states seek to exploit economic tools for influence and resource extraction, while the United States and its allies urge Canada to secure supply chains, fortify economic defenses, and play a more assertive role in economic statecraft. Canada is at a crossroads. How it responds will shape its security and economic resilience. The key question is this: is Canada prepared? Does it have the strategic foresight to protect its industries, secure its economic future, and assert itself globally? Or is it simply reacting to external pressures without recognizing the long-term consequences of its actions or inaction? To explore these critical questions, we're joined by Raquel Garbers, a leading expert on defense and economic security. As the principal architect of Canada's most recent defense policy, Our North, Strong and Free, and now a visiting executive at the Center for International Governance Innovation, she's been at the forefront of shaping Canada's response to these challenges. Raquel Garbers, welcome to Dialogue.
Thank you very much, James. It's a pleasure to be here.
In fact, this is a welcome back to the center. You've been quite a while associated with us, and we're grateful for this association.
Thank you. I'm a big fan of the center and the work that's done here. And so very much welcome the opportunity to be back. But as you and I were talking about, who knew this would be such a timely topic right now?
Yeah, no, 5-6 weeks ago, I reached out to you and invited you to be here on the show. And here you are. But I'll have to tell you that I was thinking about it differently. And so, like I like to do, maybe you just tell us your story. How'd you come along this path?
So as you mentioned, my background has been inside government, and I'm no longer inside government. But my background started really in the national security space. And so over 20 years watching the evolution of national security threats. And then I moved over to the Defense Department and sitting in a job that allowed me the opportunity to learn about strategic defense policy and begin to make the connection over to the national security policy And then coming right up the middle, I saw the hostile economic warfare. And so it became something that I made a real point of studying and trying to understand. And it became increasingly apparent to me, and I think this is the key message that I would like people to take away, is that insofar as we live in a highly, highly integrated global economy, economic warfare is the essential first phase of preparing for conventional war. So what happens in the economic warfare space will determine, I think, whether deterrence is restored to where we need it to be, or alternatively, if we're on a very bad path to conventional conflict.
Well, thanks for that opening, that introduction, that story about how you came along this path. Let's get started then. And let's begin with this first question. Help us understand what we're talking about with economic warfare.
So I think I'm going to take that in a historical direction, if that's okay, and tell you where the economic warfare that we're experiencing now, when it began and why. And really, our story starts at the end of the Cold War. Okay. And at the end of the Cold War, as you know, the US has unrivaled power. And so the Western nations are feeling quite comfortable in US power. They're feeling very secure in it. And of course, they're anxious to exchange the costs of defense for the promise of a better consumer lifestyle, right? Redirect the money, the so-called peace dividend. And into that mindset comes a foreign policy viewpoint that tells them that insofar as US power controls the global order and infuses with its values, it will be able to integrate and pacify hostile states. And instead, what it did was it opened the door and brought the hostile states into our economic and political systems, where they have now weaponized that access against us. And that's what the economic warfare, that's where it really begins, is when we brought them inside of our systems.
So, I mean, let's integrate or interrogate that a little bit. Let's understand a little bit more what you're saying. And so we let them into our systems, and now we have the situation you're describing. When did we let them into our systems, and how did it get away from us?
So, of course, bringing China into the WTO was a key moment. The entire sort of free trade, free market.
We're talking about the year 2000.
Yeah. The entire free market, free trade agenda. And building supply chains and dependencies with hostile states, in particular China under the CCP. And so when you think about what economic warfare is, it is really, at this point, about the systematic abuse of economic activities in ways that are generally covert, generally illegal, but always hostile. And there's three principal reasons that China engages in the behavior. And one is, of course, to overturn the global economic order in its favor. The second is to create and weaponize interdependencies, which we've all seen, right? Canadian canola, Australian wine, Taiwanese pineapple. It weaponizes the interdependencies for a political end. And the third thing it does, which is really important, is that it targets very specific technologies, sectors, know-how that are going to help it build its military power and help it erode Western military power. And I would just like to underscore that the characteristics of how it does it make it very, very different from normal routine statecraft. All states use economic activities to compete. That's perfectly normal, that they use tariffs, or they use sanctions, or they use anti-dumping duties. These are normal behaviors. How China does it is not normal.
Say more. What do you mean?
Well, there's two principal characteristics that distinguish it from normal behavior. And the first is in terms of the fact that it never really happens alone. It's generally part of what I call a broader basket of hostile activities. So, for example, in the information space, we will have disinformation, we will have propaganda that will be aligned with justifying the hostile economic act. Similarly, in the diplomatic space, we know that there are a series of hostile acts. We know about, certainly in the case of Canada, citizens being taken hostage for political reasons. We know many Western countries have had so-called police stations set up on their territory where members of their citizenry who have ethnic Chinese origins will be intimidated and harassed. So there's a whole basket of activities. And that's really the first distinguishing characteristic, is that it's part of a broader ecosystem of hostility. The second characteristic that makes it very different from normal statecraft is the fact that the entire society is effectively weaponized, right? Okay. So you have scientists who are sent to do research in a foreign country, and when they return home, they are obligated to provide the intellectual property that they learned in the foreign country. And because it's an authoritarian state, no is not an option. Similarly, Chinese companies can find themselves compelled to, for example, buy a startup in a Western country at 5 times its market value because it's not a commercial transaction. What they're after is the technology in that startup. And you can generally see a line between the technology and a gap in the PLA's capabilities. It was the credit where it's due, the Australian Strategic Policy Institute wrote a first report, Picking Flowers, Making Honey, and it really threw a spotlight on some of these activities and made clear the weaponization of the sectors of society. And so we end up then in a threat environment where potentially every weapon of their society is weaponized, which means every sector of our society is a potential target. So it becomes a very complex, what I call a 360-degree threat environment. And that is not routine statecraft.
Oh, that's pretty mind-blowing when you put it in that type of context. And so maybe we take a step back.
Sure.
And understand this global context of what we're talking about. I mean, how is the global, how's this economic war unfolding? And I mean, where is its most significant impacts and stuff? And so help us understand that.
So the most significant impact, I would say, has been the significant role it has played in shifting the global balance of power away from the United States, okay, right? And that process has been unfolding for a while. The United States, Democrats, Republicans alike, have been signaling to all of their allies and partners for the last decade, that it was quickly getting to the point where the United States was no longer willing and arguably no longer able to run the world, because the payoffs of running the world were no longer worth the cost of running the world. And in part, that's because of the erosion of the economic and military power of the United States and its allies. Now, to be sure, it's not exclusively due to the economic warfare, but we need to understand what the warfare does. And given that I'm interested in military power at the end of the day, there are 3 ways that it is impacting military power, which gets to your question of the global conflict piece, right? So the first, I would say, objective of the economic warfare vis-a-vis military power is to erode the Western world's manufacturing capability. Because where you have no manufacturing capability, you have no ability to ramp up military production, and you have no ability to sustain it in the event of a prolonged conflict. And so you simply are not capable of participating in a conflict if you don't have a manufacturing base. And they erode it, of course, by doing things like providing massive subsidization to their champions, their domestic champion companies, and then flooding the market, the global market, with the overcapacity, which has the effect of driving the Western competitors out of business, so that the Western countries are dependent on China for the manufacturing capability. And you have, with the integration of supply chains, you can see where that becomes a potent weapon for the CCP. The second way that it really affects military power is using tools like joint ventures, rights and licenses, loans, foreign direct investment. And this allows them to effectively gain access into the innovation ecosystems in the Western world, including the sensitive ones, because we live in the era of dual use technology. By gaining the access into the innovation ecosystem, they are able to onboard technologies that allow the PLA to leapfrog in its military capability. And what you have then is an erosion of the technology gap that deterrence relies on. And the final thing that they do, as I mentioned, is very targeted. We need to find capability X. We know Australian, American, Canadian company X has it, and they're doing research on it. So why don't we send in one of our researchers to participate in that research process, and then we will harvest the intellectual property and bring it home. So that is why it's so essential to global conflict. It's eroding our capacity to defend ourselves.
Okay.
Sorry, too much.
Well, I don't know if it's too much, Raquel, but it is expansive, and this is good. I mean, this is in a good way as we're thinking about these things. Let's pull this then, and let's help people understand a little bit about Canada's strategic position. I mean, the bottom line on this, except for the last few weeks, maybe Canada was out of the news for many people. I mean, it is the largest country, second largest country by land mass, with only 40 million people in it. So I think we lose sight of how large it is, but because of its proximity, if we think about these, if we just think about this a little bit more, we can start to maybe intuitively understand Canada's strategic position. But I want you to help us understand it better. So here, let me ask you directly: what is Canada's why is it uniquely positioned, or how is it even uniquely positioned at the front lines of this economic warfare that we're talking about? And what makes it a target for adversaries? Why is Canada so special? Why is it a front line?
As you note, it's a different moment for Canada to find itself in the spotlight. It is not something that we are used to, and certainly not from the perspective of global conflict. But we really are on the front lines of the escalating global economic war. And there's a few reasons for that, and I think you did a great job of touching on them in your opening comments. So I know you're following the news closely. So there's a few things in there. The first, of course, is the natural resources. And I think most of the viewers of your show probably already know that there is a global contest over critical minerals, rare earth elements, and quite frankly, the basic energy that we need in a world where there's a manufacturing renaissance happening, where every country is trying to friendshore and reshore. It means they all need to spool up manufacturing capabilities. So at the end of the day, the natural resources are pivotal, particularly when we see China withholding supply as a political lever on the United States and its allies. Canada has the natural resources that the world needs, that our allies and partners need, in order to fire up their defense industrial bases and keep their broader economies humming along securely. So that's the first thing. We have the resources that everybody wants and needs. The second reason we're on the front line is because we're an Arctic state. And that's not just about the resources. It's about the melting of the Arctic. As the melting proceeds apace, the Arctic will become a very strategic trade and military route, simply by virtue of cutting the time it takes to get from the Euro-Atlantic to the Indo-Pacific. And if you cut that time, that's a lot of power. Just think about trade, for example. Time is money. So you cut the time, you've increased your profits. And from a military perspective, and I know you will know this, the person who gets their capabilities from spot A to spot B the fastest has the strategic advantage. So the Arctic space is very important for us, and again, for allies and adversaries.
Before we pull off the Arctic, I should foot stomp. I know you know what you're talking about, because that was a predominant inclusion in this latest defense strategy that you worked on, the defense policy. It had been, I don't know, 7 years or so between strategies, and as I recall from my look at it, that was a big piece in there, is getting after and understanding the Arctic and how it was integral into security.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, the Arctic is the most direct route for the missiles as well to come to North America. So the Arctic is pivotal. And as you know, Russia is upgrading its Arctic military capabilities. China has declared itself a near Arctic state.
Yeah.
It's building icebreakers. It's attempting to make strategic investments in the Arctic, resource focused, but also to give itself a legitimate foothold to be in the Arctic.
Yeah.
The Arctic is heating up, and the government of Canada very wisely noted that, and that's why the defense policy is centered around the Arctic and named after the Arctic, really.
Yeah. I hope I didn't. Did I prematurely stop you on your?
No.
Okay.
No.
So let's pull on this then, and let's talk about threats and pressures. And so I'll just ask you, what specific economic threats does Canada face, and how are the Allies' expectations compounding these challenges?
So I'm going to go back to a little history tour to set the context for what's happening in Canada right now. So we are in a moment that I describe as the most significant since the fall of the Soviet Union, right? Where the United States has made
the same
clear
thing. I think you're right.
it is not able to run the world anymore. That is not to say the United States is going to be isolationist. It's not going to be isolationist. And very clearly, we are seeing no intention to be in isolation.
I think you're right there, too.
But what we are going to see and what we are seeing is a shift towards privileging the rebuild of US national power. And part of that rebuild has to be an agenda for the home front. And that's about sort of the healing of the, I would say, domestic population inside the United States. Part of the agenda is about rebuilding economic power globally, and part is about rebuilding military power globally. And this is where it all starts together comes together in terms of those pressures. On the economic, for example, the administration has been very clear that it's looking to revisit trade arrangements with countries across the globe. And so Canada, sitting geographically connected, right? All the critical infrastructures, the financial systems, the businesses, the supply chains, everything is connected. And of course, there's USMCA, the free trade agreement that, we have, for example, making a car, the parts go up and down across the Canadian-US border 8 times before the car is completed. So there is no country more deeply integrated into US trade arrangements than Canada. So it was to be expected, quite frankly, that there would be an ask to renegotiate on the economic front. On the military front, Canada is in the same boat as all of the allies, which is that the United States is looking for its allies and partners, not just to increase their defense spending. I think we're past that point. It's looking for its allies and partners to increase their defense spendings and build their defense industrial bases and make more concrete contributions towards enhancing collective power. And so for all of those reasons is what we're sort of seeing the pressure coming from the United States on Canada. At the same time, of course, we have the Chinese working very diligently at their economic warfare through Canada, with Canada as a target, but with Canada as a backdoor to the United States. And so sitting on the front lines, insofar as we're this deeply connected backyard neighbor, China wants what we have and is aggressive in trying to get it. And the United States is looking to shift that relationship in order to buttress its own national power as part of the rebuild in this new era that we're living in. I think the question many Canadians are asking themselves, and then I will pause, is why does it feel like the United States is being so intense in its focus on Canada versus other countries? And I think that pulls back to this as well.
I think we'll hold there. We're going to have some audience questions that pull on this further. I just know we will. But we've talked about a lot of the threats. So then we can flip this over, as it were, and say, what are these strategic opportunities that Canada has? And then how might it assert itself as this strong global player amidst all these pressures. So whatever.
Well, the good news is Canada is probably amongst the most fortunate countries in the world when it comes to positioning itself for the new global order. We have absolutely everything we need to be a global powerhouse. There's an opportunity in here for Canada. And there's a few things that I recommend from being focused on economic warfare in particular that I would, hope policymakers in Canada would be thinking about.
And you are thinking on this stuff now. I mean, you really are. I mean, you're writing, you're thinking about where this is going to go. So maybe you give us some heard it here first.
Oh, absolutely. I'll tell you exactly where my head is at. So I think we need to get past the immediate moment. And like all countries, I think the best solution for that is to simply take a deep breath and understand the historical moment that we're living in so that we're thinking clearly and making rational decisions. So that's really the first thing that needs to happen. But in terms of the go forward plan, I bring you back to all the reasons we're on the front lines of the economic war, because it's all the cards in our hand. And if we play them right, it makes us a powerhouse. So things I would suggest, Canada should get its minerals, its rare earth elements, and it should get its energy and gas out of the ground. It should unleash its resource sector. If we can eliminate the obstacles to that and we can unleash that sector, we will be in a position where we can be the trusted source of supply for the minerals, the rare earth elements, and the energy that our allies and partners need in the era of friendshoring and reshoring, and in the era of AI, energy-hungry AI. We have the energy. So if we get that out of the ground, we've given ourselves real strategic leverage.
Okay.
Step 2, I would reindustrialize the Canadian economy. Like most Western countries, we moved into more of the services and the high-end tech. And I'm certainly not saying I would abandon that, but I would reindustrialize. Because if we reindustrialize in an era where the defense industrial base globally is about to explode as an opportunity, as countries are looking to restore deterrence, then Canada also has the opportunity to be a secure source of supply for the manufactured goods with a vertical integration that they're fed by our own resources. So we have the opportunity to get the energy and the resources out of the ground. Stockpile, I would suggest we should do stockpiles of that so the allies have a secure source if they're subject to economic coercion from China that cuts off their source. So we should stockpile. We should have price accords with our allies to keep the price in a space where it allows them to ramp up quickly in their defense production. We should be supplying that to them, and we should be feeding our own reindustrialization to create the manufactured goods. So that would be kind of the base of what I would suggest. We also, of course, need to make our own domestic economy more competitive. I mean, we're going into an era where the United States is likely to take action to reduce its personal taxes and to reduce corporate taxes. Right. So if you're sitting next door to an economy the size of the United States that is making itself more competitive, then we too need to make ourselves more competitive. And then, of course, the other things we need to do more generally are three things. We need to secure the country, right? And that's not just about our border security, but it's really about moving at speed on the rebuild of the Canadian Armed Forces. And the government of Canada has a good plan for that and is taking real concerted action to make that happen. So that's a really good sign from the government and from Canada.
Yeah, and that was an emphasis in your defense strategy. I read that as well.
Absolutely. And the final thing is, like everybody else, I think we're going to need to get far more stringent with regard to economic engagement with China. Because the reality is Canada has all of this potential, right? And most of this potential is tied to being a secure source of supply. And that means we have to ensure that China is not inside our systems with the ability to interfere with our capacity to support our allies. And so really it's about having China inside our system carries the risk that Canada, instead of being a global powerhouse, could find itself an unwanted and unreliable partner. I don't think we're going to make that mistake. I do not think we're going to make that mistake, but it's just something to sort of talk about in terms of for those who will be planning Canada's strategies.
Let's talk about, you've laid out a lot. I want to talk about the policy and the preparedness for what you've just spoke about. I mean, so you got to ask yourself, what kind of strategic thinking and policy changes need to occur in Canada if it's going to safeguard these interests and kind of do the things you said? Maybe you might talk a little bit.
Yeah, there's a lot there, and a lot of it is not really my area of expertise, but I can point to things that need to happen. You know, to re-energize the Canadian economy, as I mentioned, we're going to have to take a look at our tax structures, and we're going to have a look at our regulatory regimes, and we're going to have to look at our innovation strategies and policies. Are they fit for the new world order? And this is not something unique to Canada. It's something everybody needs to do. We all have economic models that were suited to a world order that no longer exists. We all have economic models suited to the so-called unipolar moment. And with that moment gone, we all need to factor security much more directly into our foreign direct investment regimes, into our export control regimes, into our research security regimes. But I also think that all of those areas need to be looked at legislatively and regulatory terms. But what I would say is that really these should be looked at in a group sort of way, right? Because what's really going to be important is having trusted groups of allies. And for that economic activity to work as quickly as we need it to, for both economic reasons and to rebuild the defense industrial base, we need to break down barriers between ourselves. And so I think the era of harmonization, of investment, trade, export controls, I think that era is coming back. And so being at the front line, it would be a great opportunity for Canada to take the lead in initiating some of those discussions with allies who are most likely to be inside. I won't call it a bloc yet, James, but I will say the predecessors to the bloc.
Okay. I think I'm going to ask you one more question.
Okay.
And then we're going to, after that, we'll go to audience. You've laid out a lot. And it feels like a bit like this is a call to action, right? We need to do something, not just talk about things, but we need to do things. And so then I'll just ask you, how do you see, or how might Canada's policymakers, as industrial leaders, as industry leaders, as citizens, I mean, how can you come together and then navigate these futures and these challenges that you have and secure that future you're looking for, right?
Okay, so I'm going to give, at the risk of looking like a sycophant, I'm going to give a shout out to APCSS right here, right now.
Okay.
APCSS, I had the great privilege, as you mentioned, of spending some good time here. And in the time I spent here, I learned about the importance of what folks call track 1.5 processes, right? Where you bring together government, industry, civil society, financial sector, whoever you need, into a safe space to have a kind of Chatham House sort of conversation where they can speak more freely. And so I think I will go first to the mechanics of the call to action. I think track 1.5 and places like APCSS are going to be exponentially more important than they already are in facilitating the conversations that need to be had. I think we will also, in terms of mechanics, see governments start to provide more mechanisms and change the way they work with industry. For example, our Minister of National Defence has been, I think, really clear and very sincere in saying he wants to change how the Defence Department works with industry, because he knows that we are in the era of dual-use technology, and he understands the economic warfare, and he understands the country's opportunities. And so bringing all of that together requires having a different relationship, as you mentioned, with industry than we have had. The real question is how to motivate everyone to come into these mechanisms and to be parts of these conversations to get things going. And that, I think, will really begin first and foremost with awareness, right? Canadians, just like Germans, Australians, Americans, Swedish folk, everybody needs to understand the world has changed, and they need to understand how it's changed. And so it's going to be incumbent on anybody who can talk to talk. And that's why I'm so thrilled to be here.
Glad to have you
with you today. So thrilled to have the opportunity to start raising that awareness. The solution to the security challenge we face, obviously government is important, obviously industry is important, but at the end of the day, it's the people who are going to defend their country. Because as I said, China under the CCP has weaponized its society, which means every member of our society is a potential target. And they need to understand that. And we need to, those of us who can, who have the benefit of having this kind of knowledge, need to share it so that people can protect themselves and understand the environment that they're in. But it's definitely a call to action.
It is. Well, as we said, let's transition to the audience questions. We have several. And this first one is asking really about about economic warfare and conflict. And is economic warfare an early stage of broader conflict, or can it be used independently to achieve these geopolitical goals? How is it?
That is an awesome question. So whoever wrote that question, it's an awesome question. And my answer is it's both. Okay. Because the purpose of economic warfare at base is to destroy both our will to defend ourselves and our capacity to defend ourselves. Because if we are neither willing nor capable, then there will be no defense at the front end, and we'll simply capitulate, winning without fighting. Or alternatively, we'll try to fight, but it won't last very long and we won't win because we will not have the capacity. So in terms of thinking about attack on the will, right? That is the basket of hostile activities. There's some economics tools in there, but there's a lot of information tools in there as well. And so some of the things that folks who study this write about and that we see articles on is how to silence opposition, how to silence narratives that would serve to educate the public about what's going on. So one of the strategies, for example, as we've talked about, are intimidation tactics, right? Folks who know what's going on and would like to talk about it, but they're subject to intimidation activities, and there's a whole basket of those. There's another group of folks who know what's going on, but I think the term might have been the Australians who came up with it, I'm not sure, but they termed it elite capture, which is to say, and many of these folks I'm not suggesting any ill intent on their part, I think they just don't know that they have been captured. So they are, for example, in a business relationship with a Chinese company. And so from their own personal self-interest and their personal experience, it's a good experience and it's a beneficial one, and they don't see the larger game plan behind it. So some of them might, and they might just sort of be interested in their own wealth. Others have no idea that it's going on. And so they're not talking about it. And that's generally influential people in society. So you have those folks not talking. Then you have the critics not talking. And so there's nobody talking about it. And so there's no perception of a threat that needs to be rallied against. And that's partly how you attack the will to defend yourself if you don't know there's a threat. On the capacity, we talked about that earlier, erode the manufacturing base, gain access to the sophisticated innovation ecosystems in order to leapfrog PLA capability and close the tech gap on deterrence. And then, of course, the third tactic, which I've read about being more of a cyber focus, is the risk of CCP assets being embedded inside critical infrastructures or inside critical networks, which in a moment of conflict, that pre-positioning could allow for sabotage activities, or maybe it allows for espionage. But the idea is your capacity to fight will be impacted by those economic activities that have taken place left of Bang.
Okay. I want to pull on that capacity to fight, because now we're asking about, this question is asking about Canada and the Arctic. And you spoke about it, but the question is Canada prepared to defend its economic and its strategic interests that are in the Arctic?
So I think Canada, speaking about the economic space first, Canada over the last year or two has done a few really important things. It has tightened up its foreign direct investment regime.
Okay.
And with a specific focus on the critical minerals sector, and specifically said any sort of proposed investment in that area will be subject to extra scrutiny, particularly if it's coming from a state-owned enterprise. Something to that effect. I may not have it exactly right, but the idea is the world is on notice. We are protecting the economic assets in the Arctic, and making changes as we go, keeping it evergreen. As the threat evolves, so are we. On the military side, as you noted, the new defense policy, it's not that old, only came out in April.
Not even a year.
Our North, strong and free. And there is a whole body of work in there about building northern infrastructure, northern operational support hubs, and actual capabilities suited to the cold weather environment. And the work is being done. The minister has spoken about it publicly, that the work is being done in that space. And that includes work on a defense industrial strategy for Canada. So, and procurement reform, all the things that we need to do in order to speed up our ability to get those military capabilities out there. And at the same time, we are, of course, joined with the United States in NORAD, and we have with the United States, and I won't speak much about it because I'm not sure where their lines are, and I'm never going to risk crossing the line, but we do know that there is a very meaningful NORAD modernization program between the United States and Canada that was announced couple of years, I would say, before the new defense policy. And so that work is quite progressed. It's moving along nicely, according to the government. We've seen some statements on that. I just don't recall the details. But the bottom line is the focus on the North comes through NORAD, and it comes through the policy. And we're now seeing it come through Canada's economic security regime, which is not to say there's not more to do, because we're like every other ally in this complex threat environment. There's always more to do, and there's always value in moving faster in doing it.
That was good. This next question, I think, kind of gets at what maybe many people are kind of asking, and this person is asking it. So this is about the U.S., China, and its allies. Has the U.S. lost influence over its allies in the economic rivalry with China, or is it strengthening its coalitions? How do you see this?
So I think I would say, when we hear the ally discussion, a few thoughts run through my head. And some of them I call the three hard truths, right? Hard truth number one is I think allies are probably all kind of wandering about saying, what just happened, right? Like, not quite sure what's going on here. The rules of the road are changing instantaneously. But really, as we've talked about before and earlier today, the trajectory has been clear for a decade, right? So as much as there's a shock when the moment arrives, I think there's also deep understanding that a moment of change was coming with regard to U.S. relations with its allies. So hard truth number one is that the United States is not able, it's just not able to police the entire world anymore. It can't do it. China is a near peer military power. Russia is a significant military power. We have challenges with Iran. We have challenges with North Korea. We have terrorists. We have non-state. It's the threat environment has proliferated such that even if the United States were willing to bear the cost, it's practically not possible to do that. And I think allies understand that. The second hard truth is that even if the United States were capable of doing that, I don't believe the American population is willing to pay that bill anymore, right? The lopsided bill. And so I think that hard truth allies also understand. I think the third thing allies understand is that most of the Western powers, if not all of them, are very much dependent on the United States military capabilities for their own military defense, right? We have built around NATO a construct where the United States sits at the center of it, and the other allies have capabilities that append in, right? And that add to the greater collective whole. But there is a center of gravity in US military power, and the allies understand that, and they understand, or need to increasingly understand. I think they understand somewhat, but they need to increasingly understand the connection between the economic warfare over here and the military power over here. And if they understand that, then they will understand that it is in their own national interest. Never mind relationships with the United States, right? Like administrations come and go, tough times, hills, valleys. It's like a marriage, right? Like there's good times and bad times. But the reality is, if they understand that connection, they will understand that their own national interest demands that they get tough on the economic warfare for the same reasons I mentioned Canada needed to. If you're going to be inside these new emerging geoeconomic entities that will be driven by defense considerations, things like AUKUS, you have to be able to insulate yourself from the economic warfare, because otherwise your allies can't rely on your products. They can't let you link in to the satellite system in case you're bringing, a pre-positioned CCP asset with you. And so that's, I think, where we're going to go. So I don't think relationships with allies are going to spiral downward. I just don't see that happening. I think everybody's going to kind of, take a moment, take a deep breath, think rationally, and then say, okay, starting point, new world order. Where do we go from here together? Because we are better together.
Yeah, no, nicely said. This next question kind of pulls a little bit from there, and it's asking about tariffs in Canada. And so the question's simple. How will the U.S.'s new tariffs impact Canada's strategic and its economic positions? What it's trying to do.
So I think when thinking about the tariffs, there are four strategic thoughts that come into my head. And I will admit it took me quite a while to get to the four because it was not entirely clear what's going on there. And so I'm not saying I necessarily have it right, but these are four thoughts in my head. One is I've heard people talk about what they call demonstration effect, right? That if the United States can demonstrate the seriousness of revisiting its trade arrangements with Canada, then it serves put everybody else on notice that it will be equally serious in negotiating with them, and they should sort of start to think through what that looks like. I think that's a collateral side benefit. I don't think that's the reason that this is happening. The second thing I've heard people say is, well, it's a negotiation strategy. And I think that's entirely true, the way it's sort of being managed. I think it is a negotiation strategy. And if you read some of The Art of the Deal, it's right there telling you exactly what's going to happen, right? That comments that seem over the top will be made, and they will bring with them the ability to disorient the other side. Because if you're too busy going, what just happened? How did that happen? What you're not doing is getting your game plan together, right? And if you're sort of thinking, oh goodness, we're going to be annexed, then the bar to start the negotiation is up here. So you're going to offer concessions up here, whereas you might have started by offering a concession here. So I do believe there's some merit in the negotiation strategy. The much more important consideration, I believe, is really the U.S. intent to reset the trade relationship. And I think it's about preparing the ground for the renegotiation of USMCA. So I think that's what we're seeing. And if you listen to the sectors that are being talked about, it's very clear that these are the issues that will be discussed in a USMCA. And the final thing, the really geostrategic point of it all, came to me, I have to say, embarrassingly late, but it finally hit me. In the new kind of global order we're in, if I were a US geostrategist, I would say there's a few different categories of where I would put different countries in terms of their importance to the United States as it rebuilds its power. And the first category would be existentially important. And there's only arguably one country that is existentially important to the United States as it rebuilds its power for the purpose of deterring a slide into war, right? They're deterring a slide into war. Canada is existentially important because we're on the front lines of the economic war. China wants what we have. And if China gets what we have, it's embedded right in the US backyard with the resources, with the minerals, with the manufacturing, with the supply chains, so forth and so on. And so I think part of the message that's unspoken is simply sending the seriousness of, we really want you to be a partner with us in securing the North American continent. And we are a partner, and I think the United States is sending the same message to everybody, which is, we are partners. We have been partners for a very long time, but we are in a much more dangerous world, and we all need to do more in that space. And so I think that's a telegraphing of, you, Canada in particular, are especially important to the defense of the United States. And I think that might be a little bit of the messaging of what's going on there.
No, thank you for that. This next question was asking us to think a little broader now and about lessons from other nations. And so, how does Canada's economic security strategy compare to other middle power countries here in the region? And so, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, there's some really not my necessary expertise area, which is a strange thing to say when you study economic warfare, but the regimes are so different, right? That to really get a beat on them, I would need another 3 years so that I could study each regime independently. But
I think if I'm pulling on this a little bit, our international audience, which is kind of watching this, and they could be in South Korea, they could be in Japan, they could be in Australia, they could be in, you fill in the blank, and they're asking themselves, they've listened to what you just talked about in Canada, and they're asking themselves, what might we pull? What might we think about as we're trying to take care of our own countries and stuff? And some of it may be, one for one, do this and do that. And some of it may just be generalized thinking.
Got you.
Yeah.
Got you. Okay, so here would be my generic advice of a frame, even to start thinking things through, that I think applies to everybody. Point one, keep calm. Keep calm. Understand that what looks like an overnight tectonic shift in the global order has been coming at us for some time. So keep calm, take the time, understand what has changed, why it has changed, and understand where China is at, understand where the United States is at, understand where your region is at. Take some time to just kind of get your bearings. Point number two, figure out where your comparative advantage and leverage is to push your own national interests in this new order. For Canada, as I said, it's our minerals, but it's also our geographic proximity to the United States, because as long as we're serving as a powerhouse for the rebuild of allied defense industrial bases, then we're pretty secure under US military power, right? So think about the neighborhood that you're in and what you can offer to the broader collective effort to push back against aggressive authoritarians. So for some countries in the region, it might be as simple as thinking through, the US has to plan how it's going to manage maintenance, repair, overhaul, resupply, the whole sustainment chain through the region. Can your country build a warehouse and hold the stocks, right? Can your country provide a port? Can your country provide, the food security What can your country provide? So think through what you can bring to the table that serves your own national interests. I think that's really the most important thing for other countries to do. And then finally, again, because I always go back to the big geostrategic picture, recognize those 4 categories of countries, right? There'll be much as there's countries that will be existential for the United States, there will also be countries in tier 2 that are important, significant players on this new, alignment of countries coming together for the collective good centered around the United States. So call it Team West, Team Western, or Team Democracy, or Team America, or Team Not Authoritarian, whatever label you want to put on that. The third tier will be countries that will try to hedge. And I think many more countries have been hedging up to now than will be able to hedge as of now. There will be very, very few countries, I think, in the world that will be able to hedge, because as the pressure and the tensions are intensifying and lines are being drawn in order to manage those tensions, the ability to hedge is going to shrink for some.
If we had more time, you've just opened up a massive discussion on this multi-alignment, this hedging, this approach that I have to do another episode on that, because that is, I think you've touched on something.
Yeah.
We've got just a couple minutes, and so let's do this. Let's actually ask you to give a book recommendation. I like to ask a guest to share with the audience, if they want to know more, where might they look?
So my advice to folks who are wondering in particular what the thinking will be behind where the U.S. Defense Department is going, and we know it plays a significant role in the interagency space, I would highly recommend people read Elbridge Colby's Strategy of Denial, where he sets out...
Remind everybody who Elbridge Colby is.
So Elbridge Colby, he was, back in the day, the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense. I think it was Strategic Policy, his title, but he was the architect of the United States defense strategy and policy. And under the Biden administration, he sort of, he went out as they do, and he spent those years really traveling the world and talking to everybody to learn everything he could about where different countries' thinking was at, what their national interests would be, how they would see the world evolving. And he did a lot of really deep think about where the global order was going and what the United States should do in that new global order for the purpose of preventing the slide into war. And so his book, Strategy of Denial, really takes readers through some... It's a great piece of work because it starts by explaining some really basic international relations concepts like collective security, collective action problems, and then he explains to readers the importance of Taiwan for global economic and military security. He explains the connections to the Euro-Atlantic, and then he explains a strategy of denial, which is deny them the ability to take Taiwan so that we don't have to get into a war. So it's about restoring deterrence, really. But the thinking behind it is quite deep. And quite frankly, I can already see it in some of the activities I see coming out of the new administration. So if you want to get a beat on getting ahead of what's next, read Bridge Colby's book.
Thank you for that recommendation. And more importantly, thank you for spending the hour with us. This has been really enjoyable for me.
Awesome. Thank you very much. It's always great to be here.
Indeed.
Love APCSS.
And I'll keep coming here.
Thank you.
As we conclude today's dialogue, economic warfare is reshaping global power. Nations are using financial, technological, and industrial tools to exert influence and disrupt adversaries. Canada, like many, faces tough choices that will shape its economic security and strategic futures. These conversations shape security. Join us on February 24th when I sit down with Dr. Mimi Winbird, DKI APCSS professor, to discuss Myanmar's 4-year struggle. On behalf of all of us at DKI APCSS, thank you for being part of this important conversation. I'm James Minnich, and until we meet again, aloha oi.
As always, the opinions expressed in this program do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of DKI APCSS, the U.S. Department of Defense, or the U.S. government.